Welcome, everybody. I was going to say it's delightful to see you, but I can't actually see any of you, but I know that you're out there. And it's such a pleasure to welcome with us here today, Stefan Goebel, who is a reader in the School of History at the University of Kent. And is also director of the Center for the History of War, Media and Society. And I add also editor of their blog. And those of us who are interested in war and memory should really check it out. There is lots there that will pique your interest. His first book was entitled The Great War and Medieval Memory. It came out with Cambridge University Press in 2007. He's also the co-author of A Study of Ypres in the 20th Century and co-editor of several really important volumes on war memory and commemoration. And he has a new project, which I can't wait to add to my own bookshelf, which is entitled Coventry and Dresden, Remembrance, Rebuilding and Reconstruction, which will also be coming out with Cambridge University Press. He joins us today to talk about intersecting memories, memorializing two world wars, a topic that's near and dear to my own heart too. So welcome, Stefan.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Simon and Thomas, for organizing this splendid conference and having me as a speaker. So thank you. Now, what I'm going to try in this talk is bring together two research interests of mine, in the memorialization of the First World War and the memorialization of the Second World War. And I thought I'd use this paper as an opportunity to try to sort of connect the dots in my research, and I'm not quite sure whether it will be successful, but we'll see whether it works as a paper. Let me start sharing my screen. Okay. If you can see that, Simon, if you could give me a, yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. So I want to talk about the intersecting memories. And to illustrate that, I want to start with one moment in 1985, when the American President Ronald Reagan, here seen on the left, wearing a trench coat, and the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, seen on the right, met at the German military cemetery at Bitburg in May 1985. And it was supposed to be a poignant moment, a gesture of reconciliation, but it became a political scandal. What caused the scandal was the fact that this was a military cemetery with 2,000 German dead, but among those 2,000 dead, there were also 50 members of the Waffen-SS, and this hadn't been explained to the American president in advance. So much has been written about this scandal. I don't want to repeat that. But what I want to say is this. I've chosen this as a starting point because I think Bitburg is an interesting illustration of intersecting memories. We've got here two national memories of the Second World War that intersected and ultimately clashed. A German narrative about death and victimhood, and the American idea of the good war. And of course, the idea of the Waffen-SS wasn't a very suitable link between the two. So that's why it became a scandal. But I want to draw attention to something else, to the temporal dimension of this, because the event in May 1985 harked back to another event that had happened just a few months earlier at Verdun, the French military cemetery, and interestingly, a First World War cemetery, where the German Chancellor and the French President had joined hands in a moment of silence. Of course, what Kohl hadn't quite understood, there is a difference between the First and Second World War, and that wasn't quite able to repeat the same gesture with the American president in a very different historical context. But the important point is to understand that Bitburg, which became probably more famous, more controversial, was actually harking back to a commemoration that referred to the First World War, namely the meeting at Verdun. In a recent article in History and Theory, a group of scholars have suggested the term entangled memories, which I think is an interesting one. But I think the memories here are not quite entangled. They're not sort of fully entangled. They merely intersect. So we've got here intersection of various national memories, German, French, American, but also temporal intersections between the First and the Second World War. Because the two events are modeled on each other, and one is referring to the first, one to the Second World War. So what I want to do in this talk is to focus on the temporal dimension, how the two world wars have intersected. You can also call them vertical and horizontal dimensions of intersecting memories. So I'm interested in the temporal one. I want to ask more specifically what actually happened to First World War memorials after the Second World War. And since my expertise lies primarily in British and German history, that's where I draw my examples from. But I suppose the idea of intersecting memory might be more widely applicable, and maybe that's a discussion we can have after this paper. Just a few words on the historiography, which is absolutely vast. I mean, much of what you see sort of in my bookshelf behind me is about memorialization of the two world wars. Well, there's been a tendency to discuss the First and Second World War quite separately. These are almost quite separate subfields, First World War studies and the sort of expertise in the Second World War. But interestingly, if you go back to sort of some of the classics that really started this off, in particular George Moss's book, Fallen Soldiers, Jay Winter's book, Sites of Memory, Sites of Mourning, these make a point of discussing what I want to call intersecting memories between the two world wars, quite briefly only. It's sort of a final chapter in Moss's book, a few concluding remarks in Jay Winter's. But they draw the attention to attention to the fact that it makes sense to discuss these two world wars in conjunction with each other. Now, Jay Winter's finding is that the search for meaning after the Somme and Verdun was hard enough. After Auschwitz and Hiroshima, that search became infinitely more difficult. Now, in this talk, I want to probe Winter's point and ultimately also to qualify it a little bit. So let me start with the British case, which seems to suggest a very high degree of continuity across the watershed of 1945. I mean, almost everywhere in the UK, memorials were simply amended after the Second World War. With the Second World War sort of existing First World War memorials simply amended. So with the Second World War sort of was perfectly blending in with the existing commemorative structures. And consider the UK's national memorial, the cenotaph, seen on the left here in Whitehall in London. While all that was needed after 1945 was a stonemason to inscribe the additional dates, 1939 to 1945, into the cenotaph, and the First World War memorial became a memorial to the two world wars. And yet, in an important way, the UK's national memorial was also altered after 45, but interestingly, without making any changes to the fabric itself. Previously, so in the 1920s and 30s, the cenotaph, which literally means empty tomb, marked one end of a commemorative axis linking Whitehall, the political centre, and Westminster Abbey, the religious centre of the Church of England. And in the Abbey, an unknown warrior, which you see here on the right, was buried on the same day as the cenotaph was unveiled in 1920. And of course, there is a sort of medievalism about the unknown warrior. This sort of, those of you who attended my Horswell's paper this afternoon might make the links here. Now, the Second World War changed the nature of this dual memorial, and that's important to understand. That it was a dual memorial between cenotaph, the empty tomb, and the unknown warrior in the abbey. The relative weight shifted from the unknown warrior towards the cenotaph, perhaps unsurprisingly. Unsurprisingly, because how could a symbolic grave, a symbolic repatriation from the First World War also come to represent the Second World War? The power of the unknown warrior did lie in the fact that people could imagine them as potentially as a lost son, father, friend, and so on. But of course, that wasn't possible after the Second World War. So the unknown warrior began to lose its emotional significance, not immediately, and that's important to note as well. It wasn't a sort of an abrupt process, but a phase. It didn't happen immediately because that earlier generation of bereaved was, of course, still around. But certainly from the 1960s onwards, when that generation faded away, the unknown warrior became less significant. Now, the demise of the unknown warrior after the Second World War had also important ramifications for the transnational intersecting memories of war. Originally, the unknown warrior had been buried in November 1920 on the same day that the French buried their unknown soldier under the Arc de Triomphe. And the two unknown soldiers were a transnational commemorative project, a carefully coordinated renewal of the wartime alliance, turning it into a sort of commemorative alliance between France and the UK. Of course, these two unknown soldiers set an example for a host of other nations that followed suit in the 1920s. So the sidelining of the unknown warrior after 1945 ultimately severed that commemorative link between London and Paris that had been so important in the interwar period. So, but even with the unknown warrior demobilized, or at least diminished in significance, there were still striking continuities beyond the watershed of 1945. The cenotaph was of course still there and even more significant than before. The Remembrance Sunday ritual and the poppy appeal followed very closely. The example of the Armistice Day observance of the 1920s and 1930s. So in short, what you had in the UK was a revamped commemorative culture that built on the existing memorials and rituals. A situation where the two world wars were not just merely overlapping, but in fact intermeshed in a revamped commemorative structure. So the situation in Germany, by contrast, was very, very different. To start with, the Weimar Republic had never reached a commemorative consensus. And instead of a national memorial embedded in a shared ritual, there had been competing monuments and contested commemorations, to use Benjamin Siemens' phrase. So in other words, there was no commemorative legacy to build on, nothing or perhaps very little that the democratic West Germany could aim to revive after 1945. Moreover, the legacy of the First World War was considered poisonous because of the way the Nazis had tried to exploit it for propaganda purposes. German propaganda in the Second World War made very explicit links between what they consider the unfinished business of the Great War and their expansion project. So in summer 1940, Hitler made a point of stopping over at Ypres en route to Paris. And in this photo taken by his personal photographer, we can see Hitler and his entourage visiting the Langemark cemetery on the outskirts of Ypres. And in fact, the whole campaign in 1940 became known as the Second Battle of Langemark, just suggesting there is a direct link between the first battle in 1940 and the second battle in 1940. And these references continued throughout the war. For instance, an SS division was created later on in the war named Langemark. And during the Battle of Stalingrad, German soldiers were told to live up to the example of their predecessors of 1914, who allegedly, that's the myth goes, who allegedly stormed enemy positions, singing Deutschland über alles, sort of sacrificing themselves. So that seemed to be a convenient legacy to invoke during the Battle of Stalingrad again. So what we can conclude for now is that the First World War represented a very complicated, to say the least, complicated legacy for the Federal Republic. Now, in the following, I want to explore what happened to this legacy in the Federal Republic. What happened to the German First World War cemeteries after 1945? Now, there's a prevalent idea in the scholarly literature that the First World War was a forgotten war after 1945. To give you one prominent example, the doyen of memory studies in Germany, Aleida Assmann, she wrote in a recent book on forgetting that Germany followed what she calls a special path of forgetting, in forgetting the First World War until the centenary in 2014, when allegedly the special path of forgetting came to an end. Now, I take issue with Assmann's interpretation. I think we need to unpick that term forgetting, and rather than forgetting, I want to highlight, in fact, four different forms of engagement with the First World War after the Second. 4 modes of intersecting memories, if you want. Now, the first of these 4 modes of intersecting memories might be termed rationalizing. Rationalizing in the sense of making commemorations more efficient by reorganizing them. And this refers to some hard-nosed decisions that were taken about what to do with the war dead of 1914-1918. The dead from the First World War, which were now a rather inconvenient legacy, an administrative, but above all a financial burden on the new state. So what happened is that some far-reaching interventions in the commemorative landscape were made, especially in West Flanders. Until the end of the Second World War, there were about 270 different sites of burial in West Flanders, including some very small ones, but also including a large number of very large war cemeteries. Now, these 270 burial sites were reduced to just 4. So from 270 to 4, which meant that 135,000 soldiers had to be exhumed and reinterred in a different location in 4 concentration cemeteries one of which was Langemark, which you see here on this picture. What you see in the picture is the mass grave for all the unidentified dead. So some 25,000 men were reinterred in this space. And you can see it's quite small. It's sort of a little bit bigger than a tennis court. 25,000 is very high concentration in such a small space. So all the other cemeteries and burial spots, so 266, were dissolved. So that was a drastic cost-saving measure that represented, in the bureaucrats' language of the 1950s, this happened between 1955 and 1957, they refer to it as, I quote, the final solution of the war graves question. Now, it should probably not be over-interpreted, because in German bureaucratic language of the 1950s, final solutions were a very popular term. So people didn't make the kind of association we would now make with this. But it's still, you know, when I came across some very chilling use of language. In a very interesting essay, the historian Monica Black has discussed the ghosts of war. And Monica Black suggests that the ghosts of war shamed and plagued the living after 1945. But clearly, the ghosts of war didn't bother the functionaries of War Graves Association a great deal, at least not the ghosts of the First World War. The finances were tight, and the construction of new cemeteries had absolute priority. New cemeteries for the dead of the Second World War, of course. So what happened in Belgium is interesting. You find that you have the dissolution, the kind of getting rid of cemeteries in West Flanders, and the construction of new cemeteries in Eastern Belgium, in particular Lommel, which became the largest German war cemetery in Western Europe, opened in 1959, so just 2 years after the operation in West Flanders was finished. So a distinct topography of memory emerged in Eastern Belgium simultaneously to the dissolution of war cemeteries in West Flanders, or to put it bluntly, so getting rid of the cemeteries from the First World War was important to finance the construction of new cemeteries. So the disinterment and reburial of war dead in concentration cemeteries was a highly rational decision. And the Volksbund, the German War Graves Association, which acted on behalf of the Foreign Office in Bonn, they expected that this would not cause much emotional pain. In fact, they reasoned that who would make a fuss about the forgotten dead of a forgotten war? And I find the language of forgetting very intriguing in these documents, because it seems to be almost like a reverse image of the language of forgetting of the interwar period. The specter of forgetting had really hung over the German war cemeteries in Flanders from the outset. Now, this is a leaflet, a campaign leaflet to create a German war cemetery at Langemark. And it juxtaposes the British commemoration, War Graves Commission Cemetery and the Meningate at Ypres, you know, immaculate, impressive, with the dilapidated state of German war cemeteries in Flanders. And what was used in order to campaign for the construction of cemeteries, but also in order to undermine the Weimar Republic, which allegedly wasn't looking after its dead. I mean, the story is a bit more complicated. I don't have time to go into that now. But the very interesting thing here is to know that the War Graves Association in the 1920s and 1930s used the language of forgetting in order to campaign for this construction of cemeteries. Now they're using the language of forgetting in order to explain the dissolution of cemeteries in Flanders. Now, to come back briefly to the British case. Now, for Britain, it's been argued by Dan Tomlin that after 1945, there was sort of the perceived need to respect the feelings of the bereaved. And this perceived need of the bereaved continued to have a restraining influence on commemorative practices in Britain well into the 1960s. Now, by contrast, that was plainly not the case in West Germany. The War Graves Association proceeded with the destruction of the personal grave markers as well, without consultation with the bereaved. The bereaved were not part of their equation. And the number of formal complaints they received was actually quite small, or perhaps even insignificant. That's probably how they would have seen it. But it's difficult to say whether this is because of a lack of reaction, was because of the relatives didn't care, or because they did not feel empowered to complain, or simply because they didn't know, because this didn't really go through the press until the work was finished in West Flanders. And the tone of those who oversaw the kind of rationalization of cemeteries was often chillingly rational. But filed away in the archives are also a number of touching letters full of anguish. So the very small number of people who did complain. And among the people who complained was Hans Kollwitz. Hans Kollwitz was the son of the sculptor Käthe Kollwitz. And here I want to come to my second mode of intersecting memories, which I want to call transplanting. Now, Hans Kollwitz wrote to the War Graves Association saying that he was deeply distressed by the plans to dissolve the war cemetery at Eesen-Rogefeld. Now, Kollwitz was writing, first of all, as a son, the son of the sculptor Käthe Kollwitz, who you see here in the image on the left, together with her husband and workers from the cemetery. So he was writing as the son of Käthe Kollwitz, but he was also writing as a brother, the brother of Peter. Peter, his brother, had volunteered for the war in 1914. He only lasted a few weeks and was killed in autumn 1914 and buried at Eesen-Rogefeld. And for this whole cemetery at Eesen-Rogefeld, Käthe Kollwitz was commissioned to design the memorial, and she designed one of the most personal and profound works of art, I would say, a sculpture of two mourning parents kneeling side by side. So they're kind of side by side, but they're not exactly united in mourning, which is also interesting. I think maybe that's why they're so powerful. They don't embrace it, they try to deal with it individually. So they're beyond consolation, it seems. Extremely moving, but also extremely difficult for Käthe Kollwitz to design this memorial. It took her several years, and we know from her diaries how painful the process this had been. Now, of course, the Volksbund was not oblivious to the kind of art historic value of these figures, and so they gave assurances, reassurances to Hans Kollwitz that the sculpture of the grieving parents and Peter Kollwitz would be reunited in their new location at Vladslo, which was one of the 4 concentration cemeteries. Not very far away, but still 5 kilometers to the north of Eesen-Rogefeld. But in truth, the new ensemble departed in subtle but significant ways from the original one. So, for instance, the gap between the figures is now significantly reduced, and the figures are now positioned at the rear of the cemetery rather than the entrance of the cemetery. Well, small details, but all of this mattered a great deal. As one architectural historian stresses, I quote, war cemeteries are architectural embodiments of a personal relationship between soldier and an architect. And with the relocation of the war graves, this relationship between the sculpture, the artist, and the war graves, not just Peter's, were irreversibly severed. So, somewhat reluctantly, Hans Kollwitz agreed to this new arrangement. What sugared the pill for him was the promise that replicas of the grieving parents would be placed prominently in a war ruin in Cologne. And it was a proposal that amounted to a major endorsement for a female and socialist artist in West Germany. And importantly, the Cologne scheme had the backing of the federal president, Theodor Heuss. Since 10 years after the end of the Second World War, West Germany still had no sort of national, in inverted commas, no national memorial. The grieving parents were supposed to fill this commemorative void in West Germany. So the replica sculptures were intended to re-establish a public sphere of death and commemoration by breathing new life into these images, symbols from the First World War. And just as a kind of footnote for art historians, people interested in art history, the father figure was carved by a young art student named Joseph Beuys. So the Cologne figures were not exact copies, but enlarged versions of the original, and they were also made of a different material. And what is more, the kind of triangle between that linked the mother, the father, and the son, symbolically and spatially, really central. This sort of triangle was really central to the cemetery memorial, was completely lost. The emotional power of the original ensemble had been deeply rooted in its geographic, in the sort of specific geographic location, but placed in a war ruin from the Second World War, in a bombed-out church, St. Albans Church in Cologne. These figures now derive a new meaning from the new context. So what we can see here is that the images of Flanders lingered on, but they were overwritten by memories of the Second World War and a new narrative of national suffering and universal sadness. So the personal tribute became a collective one, and a private memorial, a highly politicized one. So here was a memorial relocated from war-torn Flanders to bombed-out Cologne, a monument from the Great War refashioned and reinterpreted in an effort to represent the Second World War. So at first sight, the grieving parents seem to run counter to Jay Winter's argument, namely, I quote, that the horrors of the Second World War made it impossible for many survivors to return to the language of mourning, which grew out of the 1914-18 war when they tried to express their sense of loss after 1945. Well, but on closer inspection, though, one can of course see that there was no attempt to revive older languages of classical nationalist and religious reference. No search for meaning beyond death. So kind of romanticism, patriotism, and even medievalism that had underpinned so much of war commemoration after 1918 had really evaporated after 1945. What was left, which is sort of very personal, emotional statements like this one. From the debate of the 1950s, I want to sort of fast forward to another important period in the sort of engagement with the First World War, the 1980s and 1990s. Here, the city of Bremen offers a particularly interesting example of a long drawn-out dispute that initially centered on the naming of a street, Langemark Street in Bremen. Now, unlike there's many Langemark streets in Germany, but unlike the others, Bremen's is not a sort of small residential side road, but this is one of the main arteries into the city, and moreover, it is where the Polytechnic University is based. So what happened in 1983 is that members of the AStA, the students' committee, took matters into their own hands and removed the street sign Langemarkstraße and rebaptized the street Willy Brandt-Straße. Well, that lasted only for a while, but then attention shifted from the street name to the First World War Memorial that was just next to it, in front of the Polytechnic. And this memorial bore the inscription "To our heroes," First World War Memorial. Now, in 1988, unknown persons toppled this memorial, making the provocative dedication invisible. Now, the university's initial response was to call in the police to investigate, but soon they realized that tolerating the memorial in its vandalized state, exercising a corrupt memory, represented perhaps the ideal solution to this controversial memorial. So the monument was left lying next to its plinth, thus blotting out the controversial inscription "To our heroes." You could say this was remembering by means of partial forgetting. Moreover, what really changed here is sort of the traditional geometry of remembrance, sort of the spatial logic of war memorials was disrupted. A vertical structure was turned into a horizontal one. Earlier today, in a paper, in Jeremiah's paper at this conference, he talked about permanent impermanence, and perhaps this sort of what you see illustrated here as well, that the impermanent has been made permanent. So since 1992, the monument in its vandalized state has become the permanent fixture, complete with a bronze plaque which explains the history, the unmaking of the memorial. So de facto, what is now commemorated is not the war, but the toppling of the war memorial in the 1980s. It seems that tensions persist because, as you can see, the street sign here, picture taken a few years ago, it seems to be in a sort of permanent state of disrepair. Students continuously trying to demolish it, and it's never quite 90 degrees erect. From Bremen, I want to move to a small town, Nordhorn in northwest Germany, not far from the Dutch border. Around the same time, also the late 1980s, early 1990s. It was in 1991 that the mayor of Nordhorn approached an American conceptual artist, a famous one, called Jenny Holzer. And the outcome, I think, is one of the most striking war memorials, memorial spaces, perhaps you should say. I know. Sort of a very unlikely match between a sleepy provincial town and one of an international renowned artist. Now, the original memorial to the fallen soldiers from the First World War was unveiled in 1929. You can see it here on the right. There is a sort of a plaque showing that original memorial, representing a nude German youth. Well, that was the question. What did it actually represent? Because it was controversial with the propaganda ministry both in Hanover, but also in its branch in Hanover, but also in Berlin, quite enthusiastic about this work of art, while the local SA leadership took exception to this design, saying it didn't represent a Nordic figure, as they put it, but rather a black person. So they campaigned against this. They eventually, the SA vandalized the memorial. It was then removed, and since 1938, so even before the Second World War, the plinth has been left empty. Then 50 years later, the town commissioned Jenny Holzer to redesign this memorial, this public square. Holzer's design is uncompromisingly postmodern. It combines horticultural, sculptural, and textual elements. Holzer converted the original space into a black garden, and it's decidedly not a green space. It features black and very dark red plants surrounded by benches on which are inscribed puzzling poems in German and in English, such as the one you see at the bottom. I don't even pretend that I understand these poems. They just add more and more to the kind of question marks that she wants to generate over this space, perhaps. So conceptually, Holzer's installation is probably very similar to the kind of counter monuments that were increasingly being erected in the 1990s to commemorate the Holocaust. And James Yang has put it very well, I thought. He says the most important space of memory for these counter memorials is not the space in the ground or above it, but the space between the memorial and the viewer, the space between the viewer and his or her own memory. I think that's the case here as well. So memorials, in this sense, act as facilitators of reflection rather than as carriers of messages. And the Black Garden opened on the 8th of May 1995, so the 50th anniversary of the Second World War. The question is it still a space for reflection about the First World War? Well, back in 1991, the Christian Democratic Youth Organization had warned that Holzer's installation might actually consign the First World War to oblivion. And certainly it's a less concrete space. It's no longer about the First World War. It's a space that invites people to think about war and violence and loss in the 20th century much more generally. So you can say that the memory of the First World War has not been deleted or obliterated, but reframed, overwritten, recontextualized, and overgrown. The Black Garden is very unusual in design, but it's also typical of the intersecting memories of the First World War. The First World War year is not forgotten as such, but it's overgrown. And it's perhaps typical of the kind of highly localized engagement with the First World War that emerged in the 1980s, 1990s. Commemoration was no longer centered on the Western Front as a commemorative space, not least because that space had actually been remodeled in the 1950s. So just at the point of time when British and Anglophone tourists were returning to the Western Front in larger numbers, West Germans were sort of cutting their links to that commemorative landscape by and large. And when they thought about the First World War, it was primarily very much about these highly local spaces, such as the Black Garden, such as the Memorial and Bremen and so on. So it's a kind of contrasting trend to what happens in the British case, because exactly at this point, the British tourists, battlefield tourists, are returning to the Western Front in ever larger numbers. And so I want to conclude by returning to the British case, and a phenomenon that I think might be characterized as recolonizing that memory landscape. And I've got to acknowledge here, this is sort of an idea I'm borrowing from my Kent colleague, Mark Connolly, a constant discussion with Mark about various things. So this is an idea came out, recolonizing. So during the interwar years, the British had treated Ypres as a kind of imperial outpost. They had superimposed an Anglophone culture on the existing landscape, Anglicized the place names, and reclaimed the whole as a holy ground of British arms. That was the phrase used in the 1920s. The holy ground of British arms. Winston Churchill suggested to keep the entire city as a ruin and to preserve it as a memorial to the British and imperial troops. And no surprise that idea didn't go down very well with the indigenous population. On the other hand, there were the British tourists were highly welcome, and the revenue from tourism was an important part of the interwar local economy at Ypres. And the Brits had a very strong presence. It was conventionally colloquially referred to as the British colony. And that colony, in inverted commas, was actually given official legal status in 1931, when the Belgian Parliament passed a law and bestowed on it a civil legal status as the British settlement. So that was in 1931. The Second World War destroyed that settlement, but from the 1980s, tourists have returned in ever greater numbers. I mean, very few would now claim it the holy ground of British arms, but there has been a trend to recolonize Ypres. What we see in the middle is a new memorial, a new visitor center built at Plugstead, or Plug Street as the British call it, in the southern sector, a visitor center largely financed by the Australian government that was keen to claim a spot in this commemorative landscape of its own. And similarly, another striking invention is the new Indian memorial on the ramparts, just on the south portico of the Manning Gate Memorial, which you see here on the left. And it was unveiled in 2011, and it was a replacement of an earlier memorial that was pretty neutral in terms of design. But this memorial, you can see it sort of represents all the heraldic lions of modern India and surrounded by Indian national symbols. The kind of India it represents is, of course, different from the India that had fought in the First World War. So it's sort of an attempt to, on part of the today's state of India, to claim the Indian history of the First World War. What it says, the inscription is very simple. It just says, India in Flanders Fields, 1914, 1918. So yes, I mean, we talk a lot about decolonizing, but we all, understanding of memorialization, but we also have to draw attention to the fact of there is sort of elements of recolonizing the Western Front, and I've just chosen two of many more examples. So let me bring this talk to a conclusion. Intersecting memories are not necessarily fully entangled commemoration. but they have a transnational dimension. Moreover, and this has been the focus of my talk, they have a temporal dimension. Commemorations of the Second World War refer back to commemorative culture of the First World War, and First World War memorials have taken on a new meaning after 1945. So in this talk, I've discussed different modes of intersecting memories, from rationalizing, that is cost-cutting and downscaling, to attempts to re-signify existing memorials by way of vandalism or redesign. My overall point is that war memorials and collective remembrance more generally has multiple layers, temporal dimensions that often intersect, and multiple layers that condition each other. So my overall point is to encourage people to overcome this division between First and Second World War studies, and to think about the intersecting memories of the two world wars. So thank you very much for your attention.
Stefan, thank you so much for really stimulating talk that will have been of great interest to, well, all of us. I think everybody I can see in the audience today, definitely, and me personally as well. We have not all that long for questions now. We have a little less than 20 minutes. We have until 7 p.m. So please, could you put your questions in the chat? Simon, is that the right thing to do? Okay, please pop your questions in the chat. And Simon and Thomas will moderate them.
If you want to take chair's prerogative, Rebecca, and ask the first question, do. If not, I certainly will while people are thinking of questions.
Yeah, you can go ahead. You can go ahead, Simon, because I was sitting here mulling over my question. I haven't formed it in my own head yet.
Well, the warning is my question is still partially formed, so hopefully it will make some sense. So I was very struck by the well, a lot of what you said, Stefan. I was very interested with the whole paper, but when it comes to the tombs of unknown soldiers, I'm wondering if we can link that more explicitly to the multiple layers that you were talking about. So not just connecting the First and the Second World War, but I wondered if, when it comes to the tombs of the unknown soldiers, whether we're talking about memorials that have further layers that reach back in the past still. So the French example is invoking Napoleonic Wars. I'm thinking of the one in Belgium at the Colonne de Cambrai, which is invoking what we might call the Belgian Revolutionary War, Westminster Abbey, all the way back to kind of medieval kings and their various battles, all the way up to the kind of colonization and imperialism that takes us into the realm of territory that we touched on with Sokari's paper first thing this morning. So I'm just wondering if it's not just a case of First and Second World War and the intersections there, but intersections that stretch back beyond 1914 into other conflicts that kind of feed forward. But again, that's partially formed, but I hope it makes sense.
Thank you very much, Simon. That's a great question, and you're absolutely right. It's not confined to these two intersecting memories. In fact, there's you find probably multiple layers. I mean, the example you gave of the institution of the unknown soldier / warrior is, of course, a particularly intriguing one, because it's itself entangled in multiple historical discourses. As you pointed out, the unknown warrior was buried later in Westminster Abbey, and that was a very deliberate decision. I mean, St. Paul's Cathedral would have been actually a much more fitting place, I would have thought, for the unknown soldier. Well, it was precisely that kind of medievalism that you of course, you are also interested in. The kind of to make the connection, the first battle of the Somme in the Middle Ages, and it wasn't all orchestrated or sort of choreographed. For instance, the king placed a sword on the coffin of the unknown warrior. That wasn't actually quite clear where that sword really came from his collection, but it then became known as the Crusader sword. So, you know, you can also see how, a symbol then takes on a dynamic of its own, with people attaching, other meanings to it that were not originally there, perhaps, because in the correspondence, it's not made clear that this was supposed to be a Crusader sword. And what the interesting thing about the unknown soldier, as you said, it's a transnational institution. It's sort of kicked off. It's worked out between the French and the British. And there's sort of slight variations: unknown warrior versus unknown soldier. Westminster Abbey versus the Arc de Triomphe. And then other nations, embrace the same symbolism. All the way to the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, when this was also revived. And then, of course, more recently, the repatriation of unknown warriors, unknown soldiers to former British colonies, dominions, Canada, Australia. The interesting thing is that it seems to be able to sort of blend in with other layers of memory. So in Germany didn't have an unknown soldier, but it was widely discussed. And it was on the cards. They would have buried an unknown soldier of their own. And they were trying to find sort of make the historical connections and find the kind of ideal location. And the location that was widely discussed would have been in the River Rhine to create the connection to the Rheingold and the Nibelung. And then they were sort of trying to claim that this was actually originally a German idea before the French and Germans, the British came up with it. So yeah, in short, yes, multiple layers. I just wanted, I suppose the idea of the talk was to bring together these two, which are often seen as very different. As Jamie rightly pointed out, it was significantly more difficult to find meaning after 1945. But that doesn't mean that all of the kind of symbolism that was available from the First World War was totally obsolete.
I have to interrupt to say there are questions coming in from all across the board. We've got questions in the Q&A, questions in the chat, and also we've got, the first question came in was actually a raise hand. So if you would like to raise your hand and ask your question in person, by all means. Tanya, you were the first to ask a question and you raised your hand, so please go ahead.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stefan, that you brought me back to my first seminar I had at university, thrown into this, giving a paper on COVID's grieving parents. And that piece also maybe points to general questions about the vulnerability public art is exposed to. I mean, in the original side where she had to say, it is a perfect example for a groundbreaking work of art, I would say, very courageous, where she expressed this grief and the singularity of her parents who could not, as you described it, could not join again in marriage and so on, but in grief. But that would be a perfect example for masterpieces, giving this example, and then the misuse of her mother at the Neue Wache, right, where she again was misused and so I think this is maybe something you can say about vulnerability of public art and the disrespect for the artist, especially maybe female artists, I don't know. The Holzer piece, to me, that seems to be a perfect example that we need a widened understanding of what a monument or a memorial can look like. Because to me, she creates a new formal language, which is very much connected to the Burnfield of Flanders or France, Belgium, and so on. Not so, you said it's very far away. For me, it's more like she creates a new iconography. Maybe you can say something about this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, a very good question. I agree with what what you're saying. Interesting, there's also maybe a connection to what Simon was saying about the different layers, because Colvitz sort of reworked a motif from medieval art, the pietà, the mother and son, in her work, and that's of course the memorial referred to in Berlin in the Neue Wache, which Kohl was also responsible for in the early 1990s. Is of course exactly that, sort of representation of mother and holding her dying son. Misuse already, I mean, art is also, of course, always open to multiple interpretations, and this pair of the grieving parents was always inviting multiple interpretations. So, interestingly, the people on the political right in the 1930s were just as impressed with this figure as people were on the left, so there, in the archives you can find people from the German National People's Party welcoming this design and seeing aligning it with their political ideology. So that was sort of probably part of the success, and it wasn't explicitly political. Now, the son, of course, in the 1950s was, you could say, complicit in reusing, recycling it. I mean, for him, it was a way of rescuing this memorial by having the replicas made. And for him, it was a chance to see the kind of reputation of his mother endorsed by becoming a sort of quasi-state memorial. Probably what he hadn't quite appreciated is how it would sort of transform the memorial, sort of in a new context, a new historical reference point, a new material, a new dimension. It wasn't exactly the same thing again. And even the kind of memorial that itself that was moved to a different cemetery, of course, that ultimately, the original song was impossible to replicate. Abuse of an artist, but partly tolerated by the executor of her will in order to secure a legacy for her.
I muted myself. I'm unmuted. Stefan, we got questions, 3 or 4 questions in the chat, but I think the first one that came in was actually in the Q&A. And if you like, I will read it out. It's from Laura Wood. It's a long question and it might end up having a very short answer, but let's find out. Interesting comparison to the United States in terms of World War I and World War II memorials. There were many large World War I memorial structures, but then for World War II, they mainly were living memorials such as trees planted, stadiums, or buildings named. These, of course, were often torn down or forgotten. After the installation of the Vietnam War Memorial and then its popularity, many communities wanted to create Vietnam memorials and discovered they had no permanent memorials since World War I, none for the Korean War either. So in the US communities, you see these new memorial parks beginning in the late 1980s and 90s that have these new World War II, Korean and Vietnam, and now Afghan and Iraq War memorials. Were there such, this is the question bit, were there such living memorials to the Second World War in Britain, comparable to those in the US that subsequently were often torn down, renamed, or in the case of trees, removed?
Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, the Americans might have actually borrowed this from the British, maybe Australians. There were sort of traditions, what they called utilitarian memorials. So it probably places a slightly different emphasis, but it goes in a similar direction of creating amenities, of creating memorials that were not monumental, that were part of the quotidian life of people. So the idea was that the memory would infiltrate the everyday life. So you had sort of hospital beds dedicated to soldiers, libraries, even swimming pools and playing fields. Very popular with public schools in the UK. That could, of course, you know, killing two birds with one stone. They want to have a new playing field, and they need a memorial. So there's also very instrumental reasons behind it. But the symbolism was, of course, a powerful one. The idea is that, you know, you create a playing field in order to educate and teach and a new generation that would sort of fill the shoes of the lost generation. Now, what happens to these memorials later on is very interesting, but it hasn't really been explored by anybody. The most striking of these living memorials is, I think, maybe the Addenbrooke's Memorial in Cambridge. Now, Addenbrooke's is the university hospital in Cambridge, and they built an extension to Addenbrooke's after the First World War, which was part of the Cambridge Memorial Scheme. Now, Addenbrooke's moved to the outskirts of Cambridge in the 1970s. So the question is, what actually happened to the addition to the memorial, to the hospital that was sort of a wing built to house nurses? So what happens when a memorial like that moves? Now the building that was formerly Addenbrooke's is now the business school of the university. So I think that memorial might have been lost. And that's exactly the point that critics of living memorials, utilitarian memorials, had already voiced in the 1920s, 1930s, saying that, yes, we now know what this is, but what about 30 years on? Who will remember what that playing field, that library, that extension was originally meant to symbolize?
Thank you, Stefan. We have 3 more questions. We also only have 3 minutes, but if everybody's okay, we could hang around a little bit longer. These questions are really interesting. Stefan, is that okay with you?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah,
fabulous. I'm embarrassed to say it, but Simon or Thomas, you might have to briefly take over the chairship because I have to check on my bread that is baking. At 7. But I will read out the next question. Yeah, I think I was an okay. The next question is from Sarah May, my dear colleague. She says, thanks for such a stimulating talk. Do you think the intersection creates a unit which doesn't allow for subsequent wars? I'm thinking of the naval memorials in Portsmouth and Plymouth, where the structure has 2 wings, and there are small commemorations of those who died in subsequent wars and conflicts around the back.
That's a very interesting question. I suppose I've got to ponder on it. I suppose that's sort of what people who intended. I mean, I suppose there are sort of, on the one hand, there are sort of intentions to convey a message about actually, you know, this First World War is supposed to be the war to end all wars, but that the Second World War really ended it. So to bring matters to a conclusion. So that might have well been the intention. But then there's also the pragmatic element always, and I think that always comes together in memorials, sort of the symbolic and the pragmatic. It's so difficult now to invest ever more energies into memorialization, having already built huge structures after the First World War. So it's a pragmatic decision in the UK to integrate the Second World War into the memory script. And of course, it just doesn't happen just at the memorial level, but the Imperial War Museum, of course, is equally happy to extend its remit and embrace the Second World War as part of their commemorative memorial research project. So I suppose it's sort of intended symbolism, but also pragmatism that's coming together, in these decisions.
So Rebecca has asked me to assume command while she's checking on her bread. The next question I can see is from Andy Popperwell, asks Stefan, at what point does human memory become something in a history book? I have my grandfather's diary from the Third Battle of Ypres, and it's very precious, but what will it mean to those who never knew my grandfather or others of his generation?
Very good, yeah. You know, on a theoretical level, sort of scholars of memory have considered this question, and a sort of a theoretical model that's very popular in the German historiography is one developed by the Assmanns, Jan and Aleida Assmann in conjunction. They distinguish between a communicative, what they call communicative memory, which is sort of a lived memory and a sort of part of a communication. On the one hand, and what they call a cultural memory. This is sort of an institutionalized form of memory that relies heavily on memory aids, such as memorials, such as commemorative rituals. And I suppose what we find, we've got sort of a long juncture in history where sort of the communicative memory of the First World War, you know, is coming to an end, and the cultural memory has started. I think probably that process started in the 1970s with the demise of the veterans generation. But it seems that the communicative memory still has a very long shelf life. But I suppose ultimately it's it will be a question of either fading away or being transformed into a cultural memory. And what we often find with these sort of personal memoirs, that people donate them to libraries and museums. So that's where the kind of communicative memory becomes part of the cultural memory, where the family narrative enters a broader sort of collective collection of testimonies. I suppose that's sort of very much behind the idea of people who donate their work to the Imperial War Museum, for instance, and other archives, because they think that's the best way to preserve this memory rather than to pass it on in the next generation that might not really appreciate that diary. So have a look at, both Jan and Aleida Assmann's works have been translated into English, and it's not easy reading, I mean, but they're available in English, both as books from CUP.
Thanks, Stefan. We will take one more question, and apologies to anyone who's, if there's any more questions who have that have come in, sorry. The question is also from one of my colleagues, Hilary Orange, who is saying that she is struck by the presence and absence of bodies, the presence or not of people interacting with the monuments, as well as the bodies in the monuments, sculptural figures. My question, following Gary Vecken's work on pilgrimage, is about touch. Have you learned or noticed anything about traditions of touching memorials, and if those traditions might have changed from World War I to World War II and thereafter?
Yeah, that's an intriguing question, and reminds me of Jay Winter writes about sort of touch, sort of as a ritual of separation, and in particular not just touching the memorial, but specifically the names on memorials. And I think we had this earlier question about the Vietnam memorial, and of course that's where that sort of tradition was revived and sort of made its way from one commemorative culture to another one. It was very strong always in France, and I think we're not enough expert on France to say that definitely, but I think this might have survived longer in France than elsewhere. Now there's a dividing line running between British and German commemorations in the 1920s, 1930s. Well, certainly those in charge of war cemeteries. They didn't nearly put as much emphasis in Germany on names and individual bodies as they did in Britain in particular. I mean, you can see in inscriptions and in Pierre Wargrave's cemeteries how scrupulously accurate they try to be about names, because there are headstones and they say, you know, so and so believed to be buried in this plot, or sometimes buried near this plot. So they're very extremely accurate about a connection between names and bodies. And the commission made the decision not to have what Fabian Ware called fake graves. So if they couldn't make this connection between names and bodies, then they would, the unknown bodies would be buried in the cemetery, but the name would be commemorated on one of the major memorials, such as the Meningate or the Teapot Memorial. But in the German case, what happened in the construction of the Langemark Cemetery, which is one of the kind of flagship cemeteries on the Western Front, is that that connection between names and bodies got lost. The landscape architect didn't care very much about names and bodies. They were too obsessed with their own design, so they didn't pay attention to this, and then they sort of lost the ability to identify graves. And in the internal papers, that people in Foreign Office say, "Well, this is a potential scandal, so we've got to keep quiet about this." But those who in charge of designing, they didn't pay very much attention to this. They considered it insignificant. They thought it was about commemorating community, not about commemorating individuals. So I think that sort of tradition of individual naming and commemoration and the associated rituals are probably stronger in the British and French cases than they are in the German case. But it's interesting. Maybe I should explore that further. For what do people do sort of in terms of performance with these memorials in the 1980s? I mean, given the very rational discussion in the 1980s, I doubt that there is so very much in terms of a bodily language. I mean, it's a very sort of very rational approach to these memorials. I've seen a sort of a problematic legacy that's got to be critiqued. So a kind of tradition of touching them wouldn't really fit in with that. But when did it stop, if it ever really had a strong hold on the German imagination? Yeah, very good idea. I should I'll explore that further.
Everyone, I think we better draw to a close. I just want to tell you my bread is not burned, that it's been a pleasure to be here tonight, that I did have, I don't know if you saw the cogwheels of my brain turning, but I did have a question. It was about France. I don't think it's fair, so I'm going to ask you next time, Stefan, next time. And just to thank everybody who's been here tonight, and also just a huge round of applause and thanks to Stefan for a really interesting paper. I guess you have to give it virtually.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for joining us tonight.